everyone, welcome to my kitchen. My name is Chris and today we are going to be canning broth. We are going to be canning broth that I made over the last couple of days. I have two different kinds of broth, a deer broth and a chicken broth that we're going to be canning together. If you'd like to see how I made the broth, I will link my post on how I made it in the description below. They've both been chilled and the fat has been scraped off the top. You don't have to get all of the fat out of it. If you notice, you can still see some bits of fat in both of these, and that's okay. But you do want to try to get the majority of the fat out, and that is because fat can go rancid, and if you leave a lot of fat in there and it stores on your shelf for a long time, you can run the risk of that going rancid and spoiling your batch of broth. It might seem counterproductive to take the broth that's hot, cool it down first, and then heat it back up to can. Because you want to get all of that fat off, or as much of that fat as you can, it's a step well worth taking. I like to do it just to make sure that I have the most shelf-stable and delicious broth that I can have. So we're going to take these and we're going to heat them up. Since I have two different types of broth, I have two different pots here. I'm going to heat them up separately. There's only about 2 quarts of each of these. I'm not going to heat these too fast. I'm just going to slowly heat them up, and I don't want them to come to a full boil. As the broth is heating up, I'm going to heat up the jars at the same time. The goal is to have the jars and the broth be about the same temperature when I go to can them. This is my pressure canner. I use a 16-quart Presto pressure canner. It's the cheapest, most affordable one you can get. It was given to me as a gift several years ago, and it's worked beautifully. It's worked beautifully since I got the courage to try it. I'm not gonna lie, I am one of those people that was very nervous to start pressure canning. I had water bath canned pretty much my entire life. I grew up with it, my mom did it, we made jams and we canned tomatoes. We did only things that could be water bath canned because my mom was also nervous about pressure canning, so she didn't even have one. And everybody hears the stories about pressure canners blowing up and how unsafe they can be, and I feel like it's completely natural to be nervous about that. But once I actually started using this, I realized that there's nothing to be nervous about. The pressure canners nowadays, they have safety features built in. So even if you tried to blow this up, it would be really, really difficult. You would have to modify it in order to make that happen. And I don't recommend doing that. Unlike water bath canning, when we pressure can, we're only going to add about 1 to 2 inches of water in here. I don't know if you can see here, but there are actually marks along the side. And this bottom one, it's right here. That's the line we're going to add the water to. You can see this canner has been used quite a few times, so I don't even need the mark along the side. It has a water line where I've always filled it. This right here at the bottom, this is the rack. It's the rack that came with my pressure canner. You never want to can either water bath or pressure can without having a rack at the bottom. You do not want those jars sitting right at the bottom in direct contact with the heating element below it. You can risk the jars breaking if you do that. So make sure you always have some kind of a rack. And it doesn't have to be the fanciest thing. I have seen it where people tie canning rings together to form a rack at the bottom. And if you can make that work for you, that's great. Don't be afraid to kind of DIY something as long as it works. It can handle the heat and the pressure that you're going to put it under, and it keeps the jars off the bottom and stable. The jars do have to be stable in there. We don't want them moving about or rocking back and forth. So as I put my jars in there, I'm gonna fill them with a little bit of water. This is just so they don't start to float in here. Our broth is hot, our jars are hot, so let's get the broth in the jars and then set the canner to start building pressure. As I fill these jars, I'm going to need a funnel. The funnel is important so we don't make a mess. I'm filling these jars. They have a 1-inch headspace. So I stopped it here so there's 1 inch between the top of the liquid and the top of the jar. This headspace is important in order for the jar to process properly and seal. I only ended up getting 3 full quarts. I still have a little bit of the deer broth left. So I'm just gonna stick this in the fridge and we'll use it for a meal here sometime this week. We want to clean off the rim of each of these jars to make sure there aren't any little bits of food or broth that could affect the jar sealing. So I'm using just a little bit of vinegar and just wiping off the rim here. I'm using vinegar because broth tends to be fatty and vinegar will help clean that off. If you use water and fat don't mix. So water won't really clean the lids off if you have something that's kind of fatty. So put our rings on, finger tight. You don't want them too loose because they'll fall off, but you don't want them too tight, otherwise the air that's inside of these jars can't escape and you'll end up with the lids buckling. So just gonna place them in here. We should be able to can these 3-quart jars by themselves without issue. You don't want to can just a jar all by itself because then it leaves too much room and the pressure won't build correctly. But having 3 in here should be fine. You don't need an entirely full canner to run the pressure canner, but just make sure that it isn't almost empty either. So now that we have our jars full and inside the canner, we want to go ahead and start building pressure. So I'm going to turn it and I'm going to lock it into place. Now that we got our jars filled and in the canner, we can go ahead and start building the pressure on it. I'm just going to leave this on and I'm going to heat and let it heat up. At some point, the water that we put in here is going to start to boil and it's going to create steam. So the steam is going to vent through this right here. Once it starts venting, we're going to vent for 10 minutes. We're going to vent it to get all of the air that's in this pressure canner out. We don't want any air in there, otherwise the pressure won't build correctly and the canner will be reading the wrong pressure. That will end up with an unsafe product. So we want to make sure that we vent it properly. That way we don't have to worry about it. I don't know if you can see that very well, but it is steaming pretty good right now. If you saw that, it's just a continuous stream of steam that's coming out of this vent, and that's what you want to see. I'm going to go ahead and start the timer for 10 minutes. After 10 minutes, we're going to go ahead and we're going to cap this vent with our weight. And that is going to cause this canner to start building pressure. There are two ways that you can track the pressure that's inside this canner. One is just the dial gauge. You see that right there in the middle. That's one way to do it. The thing you want to keep in mind about dial gauges is that they have to be tested every single year. You also should test them straight out of the box because they can go off a little bit and read the incorrect pressure. Every year, before you start using them, you need to get them calibrated, or at least double checked by usually it's an extension office, like a county extension office that'll do it for you. You can look it up on the web and see who near you can test pressure canner dial gauges. The other option to use, which is the one that I choose to use, is a weighted gauge. For the Presto, it looks like this. So this is a 3-piece weight. You have this, which is 5 pounds of pressure. If you add 1 ring, it becomes 10 pounds of pressure. And if you add the 3rd ring, it becomes 15 pounds of pressure. The amount of pressure you use is going to be determined by the altitude you live at. If you live below 1,000 miles above sea level, then you will most likely be using the 10 pounds of pressure. That's where I am, so that's what I'm going to pressure can at. If you live above 1,000 feet above sea level, you're probably going to need the other weight plate to make 15 pounds of pressure. The thing I like most about these is that they work off physics. I don't have to worry about the dial gauge. I don't have to worry about calibrating it. You don't have to calibrate these. It's 10 pounds. Like this right here with the 1 weight plate is 10 pounds. It doesn't matter if I toss this across the room and tried to use it. It would still be 10 pounds of pressure because it's just based off physics and nothing more. The dial gauge, however, one day I was using the canner and once I was done and it cooled down, I took the lid off and I washed it and I went to go set it aside to dry and I accidentally dropped it. And I dropped it upside down and the dial gauge hit the countertop. Ever since then, my dial gauge is way off. I was so glad that I had already got a weighted gauge because it doesn't matter if the dial gauge is way off now. I just read based off this and I know that my canner is at the correct pressure. If I had been using only the dial gauge, then I wouldn't have been able to use the pressure canner at all until I got the gauge tested and recalibrated. If you have one of the Presto canners, either the 16 and I think the other one is a 24 quart pressure canners, I will link below the weighted gauge that I got. I just got it off Amazon. I didn't have to order it specially or anything like that. So I will link it down in the description so you can see what I have. If you have this kind of canner and decide that you want to switch over to a weighted gauge, you can see which one you'll need. My 10 minutes is up, so I'm take the weight, flop it on. This canner is now ready to can the broth that's inside of it. As it starts building pressure, what will happen is this right here, this is a lock and it will pop up. That locks the lid into place. Once that lock is in place, you can no longer open that lid. This lid will be sealed on until the canner completely depressurizes. There's also the safety feature right here in the back. That is your safety release. Should this canner build up a lot of pressure, like over the pressure that it can handle, that little rubber piece will shoot off and it will open up the hole that it is currently plugging and it will release the pressure that's inside the canner. Between those two safety features, the fact that that lock goes into place and you cannot budge that lid even if you tried, and then the safety valve on the back, that rubber little gasket, it makes it virtually impossible for you to blow this up. Technically you can overpressurize it, but then that gasket will pop off and it will release the pressure. Nobody gets hurt. Sometimes when we're new to pressure canning, like that is, I know for me at least, that was the biggest fear, is that I was going to have this massive blow up if for any reason I forgot or I didn't pay close enough attention and it overpressurized. But it simply is just not the case. There are other types of canners out there that have their own safety features to them. They're a little bit different than the Presto here, but they're still in place to help prevent that from happening. They aren't gonna blow up either. You can use all of these more modern pressure canners without any safety worries. Our canner is now up to pressure. You see here, it's doing the little hula dance. It's a gentle hula, not crazy back and forth. We don't want that. That means it's too high of a pressure. Now we get to set our timer. For quarts, we can this at pressure for 25 minutes. So we got 25 minutes. As long as this doesn't drop below pressure, then we're golden for 25 minutes. If it happens to drop below pressure at any point, we would stop the timer and restart it for another 25 minutes once it comes back up to pressure. Our timer's up. What we're gonna do is we're gonna turn this off. I'm gonna completely turn off the heat. I'm also just gonna unplug it. That's a safety issue for me. If it doesn't need to be turned on, it doesn't need to be plugged in. We are gonna let the canner cool down and depressurize naturally. What that means is we're not gonna help it out. We're not gonna take the weight off. We're not gonna pop it off and let it release the pressure that way. If we did that, then it's going to depressurize too fast and it's gonna suck the contents out of our jars. We want the contents to stay in the jars, so we're not gonna help it out any. We're just gonna leave it. It will do its thing. It will take a little while for it to fully come down and depressurize. When it does, this little lock that I showed you earlier, it will drop. Once it drops, you'll know the canner is completely depressurized and we'll be ready to take that weight off. We're still not gonna be completely done and ready to take the jars out, but we're gonna be very, very close. There will still be one more step we're gonna take before the jars come out. Our lock just dropped, which means this canner is fully depressurized and we can open the lid, but we're not gonna open it yet. What I'm gonna do is I'm gonna take this weight off and set it aside. And I'm going to let this continue to vent for another 10 minutes. The reason I'm gonna do that is because even though there is no pressure left in this canner, there's still a lot of heat. And we're just gonna let that heat continue to come out of that vent for a little bit longer. Those contents are still very, very hot inside that canner. And if you let the colder air come in too fast, then you can increase your chances of siphoning. Letting that heat slowly come out for another 10 minutes from that vent and have cold air kind of slowly move in, it will help them equal out a little bit more slowly and stabilize the contents that are in the jar. After the 10 minutes are up, then we can take that lid off and pull the jars out. They should be ready to go. They shouldn't have any siphoning, hopefully. Usually I don't have too many problems with broth when I do it this way. Sometimes if I have something that's kind of thick, sometimes I can have problems with siphoning, but with broth I usually don't have any trouble as long as I follow these steps. It's been 10 minutes, so it's time to take our jars out. Make sure when you take this lid off that you open it away from you. There's going to be a lot of steam that comes out and you don't want to get burnt by it. There's our jars. They look lovely. I'm going to set them on this towel that I put right here on my counter. Nobody's going to disturb them here for the next, 24 hours or so, which is how long I'm going to leave them. I'm not going to touch them. We're not going to move them. We're not going to do anything. We're just going to leave them. And I can tell just by looking at the level of the liquid in the jars, as well as the water that's still remaining in the canner, that's perfectly clear. There's nothing in it that we didn't have any siphoning issues with this. So that is one of my biggest goals. Safely can, don't get any siphoning. As long as I get those two things, I am one happy girl. And this time we did. So now we have 3-quart jars ready to go. After they've cooled, we'll go ahead and label them. We're going to take the rings off. You don't want to store the jars with the rings on. That can create what's called a false seal. If one of these seals happens to fail, we want to know it failed, because if it fails and you have that ring on, then it can clamp that lid back down onto the jar. But because that lid has come off and then went back on, it let air in. And that air inside the jar is going to make this unsafe to use. It's going to cause mold issues. It's going to cause a lot of issues, and it's just not safe anymore if that happens. If we don't store it with the rings on and we take them off, if one of these lids fails and it comes unsealed, we'll know it came unsealed. Like, the lid will just kind of be sitting on. It won't be vacuumed on like it is when it first seals. And then we know right away that that jar is not safe to use. Thank you for joining me in my kitchen today while we got this project done. If you liked this video, please hit the like button and please consider hitting the subscribe button. If you want to be notified of my next video, you can also hit the bell right next to subscribe and you'll get a notification when I upload my next video. Thank you so much for joining me. I hope to see you next time.